Federer, 12 Final Days comes out in just over a day or two. It's a supposedly candid look at his last few days as a professional tennis player, and I'm sure I'm one of the many tennis fans around the world that can't wait for it to come out. So, in anticipation and celebration of getting to see more of Federer, I wanted to talk about this fantastic book. It's called The Master by Christopher Clarey, who is an American journalist that has reportedly interviewed Federer more than anyone else. As someone who's read and watched almost anything there is on Federer, this was a breath of fresh air because it's full of details on Federer's sporting career and life, while at the same time being respectful of the working professional relationship that Clarey built with Federer. Honestly, it's one of those books that I bought at full price and somehow don't regret, so I highly recommend this. I personally found the first half of the book more interesting because it deals with Federer's early years prior to his success. So let me highlight 3 things from this book that I found super interesting, and I'll be keeping these 3 things in mind when I watch 12 Final Days to see if that documentary can add to them. I hope you find these 3 things interesting too, and I hope this kind of inspires you to go out and purchase this book because it's one of those things that I feel deserves more praise than it gets. Federer has had a huge influence on me, and more than anything, I'm a fan of how he's handled himself professionally. That's because very few, if any, can ever hope to match his style of play and the heights he took it to, but almost anyone, to a much greater degree, can learn to emulate his professionalism, his attitude, and the ease at which he's gone about his many commitments. So this is the lens that I'll be looking through for this video today when I highlight the 3 things from this book. The first is about the mental work that was required for Federer to unlock his potential, and the last 2 can be grouped together as being about the people that had an outsized influence in his career. The only thing that could stop him was his head, his nerves, Fry said. And at the end I said to him, and I remember this very well, "Roger, listen, you can hold up the biggest trophies in the world, but try not to be your own enemy because then it will be more complicated." This is not a surprise, right? We all know about Federer's early days and how he had trouble controlling his emotions and attitude on court. Here's a bit more about this. For the moment, he was struggling just to make it to practice on time and keep his room clean. "Not his strength," said Allegra with a laugh. "There was a lot of PlayStation." His apartment was a disaster zone. You cannot imagine. In the morning when I went in there, we could not even tell if he was in there or not. It was that messy. The thing that everyone realized is that while Federer was kind of playful in practice matches and in training, he could turn it on in a snap and go from nothing to pure competitive fire in just an instant. Allegra had to be satisfied with a few scattered victories in practice matches where Federer was seldom an irresistible force. "In practice, I even beat Roger when he was number 1 in the world," Allegra said. "That was not very difficult sometimes, but in official matches, that was a different story." "Competitively playful is how I describe him at that stage," he said. "Everything was a game, whether it was on the court, off the court, or in conversation. And still today, if you have a casual conversation with him, just having a guy's talk, there's always an element of competition to it, whether it's a joke or more serious. But because of his playfulness, it was hard for him to keep his concentration and to really stick to one thing in those days. He needed a lot of variety, and if he didn't give him variety, he would become a nuisance, like right away." So, among other things, Federer's parents and coaches decided that he would benefit from working with a sports psychologist. That ended up being Dr. Christian Marcoli, who was just 25 at the time he started collaborating with Federer, one of his early clients. This is what he had to say. "Roger always had the passion to win," Marcoli once explained to L'Équipe, the French sports publication. "At a certain moment of his career, he made the choice to learn how to use this energy in a constructive way so he could reach his maximum potential. That was the focus of our work together." This energy often led to destructive outbursts, which is well known about Federer. And it wasn't just his coaches and parents, even Federer realized that his mind needed work. Federer had reverence for the increasingly grand settings in which he was playing, but he also recognized that his outbursts were impacting his performance as he advanced deeper into draws. "I knew I was getting so drained from my behavior, so I would come to, like, the quarters of a tournament and be like, I'm so tired," Federer said. "It wasn't because of the matches, but because of the way I felt during the matches. It was so emotional. The funny thing was, when I was 12 or 13, everybody behaved like me. Marco Ciudinelli and Michael Lammer, we all did it. We were all grunting and trying to piss the other guy off, and I honestly don't know all that we were doing. It was normal to behave like this, and all of a sudden, one thing leads to another, and you are on the big stage, And you can't behave like this anymore because now you're playing Pat Rafter or Pete Sampras or someone you actually admire. You know what I mean? It just can't be the same. It was about learning to control the flames instead of extinguishing them, about converting them into slow-burning fuel rather than a bonfire of distraction. I'm going to say what Federer had to say about this energy in just a moment, but first I want to say, as someone who has struggled with this exact thing in the past, I could definitely relate. When I was young, I didn't understand what having the right energy, the right intensity was. It was like, what does that mean? Is it like a look thing? Is it like a walking around thing? What is it? But it's that laser focus, point by point mentality, because what happens when you are young is you start drifting off. That's the battle. When you're young, you're like, oh, what are we doing for lunch? What are we doing after? He said. Sometimes you are in the mood, sometimes you are not. And the problem is when you are not, you start losing points like it's a waterfall. It's like 15 love, 30 love, 40 love, love 15, love 30, and then you're like, oh my God, I have to focus, and it's too late. If you struggle with something like this or have struggled with something like this, it's very hard to know what you're experiencing when you're in the moment. But that's why reading is really good. It kind of forces you to get someone's clear thoughts on what they were feeling back in the day and how they made sense of it. I wish I had read this when I was younger and was struggling with this. I think I would have been able to get over it much faster. Their collaboration would last approximately 2 years, and though they hardly resolved Federer's issues entirely, the tools that Federer acquired with Marcoli allowed him to shift into a higher gear. That gave him the keys, Lynette Federer told The Keep in 2005. I think he is still using these processes on the court. I've never spoken to him about it. It is his world, not mine, but it seems obvious to me. There would be more that would push Federer into even higher gears, namely the tragic death of his childhood coach Peter Carter and the person who would eventually turn out to be his wife, Mirka Vavrinec. More on Mirka later, but I want to mention just this one little bit about Peter Carter. Carter's life had been far too short, but at least if Federer could achieve what Carter had envisioned on court, then that life had served some part of its purpose. I did find a new motivation, Federer told me. In Carter, he had a cause greater than himself, one without a clear finish line. That was the turning point, Allegro said. It's tough what I'm going to say, but seriously, I don't know if Roger would have had the same career if Peter would have still been alive. But there is also the possibility he would have become an even better player, because in my mind, it was clear that at some point he was going to take Peter back as a coach. Rosé could sense a change in Federer, using the French word déclic, which translates roughly as eureka moment. I think Peter's death made him grow up very quickly, Rosé said, and it made him feel like he was on a mission. The point I want to focus on is that at the time Federer received help from a sports psychologist, it was still considered to be a weakness to need or to want one. Mental health is extremely important, and I'm glad that the stigma around it is lifting these days. And as a Fed fan, I'm even more glad that others around him were able to rally against this to get him help. There is no shame in seeking help, and if you can relate to this, I want you to know this. There is absolutely no shame in seeking help. And Federer stands as an example for this. So if the best amongst us need help, why shouldn't we? It's fine. It's okay. That's why I want to introduce the sponsor of today's video, BetterHelp. Nah, I'm just kidding, but I got you, didn't I? In all seriousness though, I think it's a bit of a shame that Federer hasn't spoken more about the specifics of his mental work, especially now that he's retired. Marcoli and Peter Carter had agreed that when, not if, Federer won his first Grand Slam title, they would each smoke a cigar. Sadly, poignantly, he went onto the balcony of his apartment in Bar, Switzerland, and smoked his alone. Federer has never gone nearly that far publicly and has spoken little of Marcoli through the years, but he did acknowledge some benefits in one of her early interviews. But neither Marcoli nor Federer has publicly explained their work in detail because that is Federer's wish. We agreed to that relatively early, and then over time we talked and reconfirmed it, Marcoli told me. While I do understand that some things are better when kept private, I also think a lot of us have looked up to Federer, so his ability to influence positively in this space is perhaps a bit underrated. Personally, I think it's better and more useful than his ability to sell sunglasses. I don't expect to see any more insight on this in the documentary, but one can hope. Nobody can win a Grand Slam by themselves, let alone have the career that Federer has had. So let's talk about some of the people that have had an outsized influence in his career other than his parents. Pierre Paganini is Federer's fitness coach. He's been on his team since 2000, so that's longer than anyone else. Here's a few people on Paganini. The most important guy in Federer's career is Paganini, said Günter Bresnik, a veteran Austrian coach. That is a bold statement, and Bresnik is not alone in putting so much emphasis on Paganini. For me, it's Mirka number 1 and Pierre number 2, said Allegro. If there's a big decision, Pierre would always be involved because I think Pierre has always had the big picture in mind. Roger trusts him like crazy. Stan Wawrinka, the other Swiss star who has trained with Paganini for more than a decade, says he owes more to Paganini for his own career than anyone. But Federer is not quite prepared to take that leap publicly. He has had too many influences and has too much diplomacy to elevate one key contributor above the rest. What is clear is that Paganini is on his shortlist, his very short list. A big part of the reason that I'm here where I am today is definitely because of Pierre, Federer told me late in his career. I find it fascinating that Paganini's natural inclination is towards what happens behind the scenes. This is what Paganini has to say himself. I was 8 and I wanted to know what was going on in the locker room, what the manager was saying to them when we couldn't see them on television, he said in an interview with the Swiss newspaper at 24 Hours in 2011. Even at that age, I was fascinated by the hidden side of it all. In my job, we work often in the shadows, and I really love that. I'm the same way, so I tend to pay attention when people like Paganini talk. In tennis, you don't do one sprint like a guy who does the 100 meters, Paganini said. You go for 3 hours or more, stop and go. That's very tough, but you have 25 seconds or 90 seconds to recover. In all the work you do, you have to stay aware of that. We don't ask you to beat a speed record. We ask you to be fast repeatedly for a long time. They would do intense tennis footwork while catching and throwing a medicine ball, then grab a racket and do the same footwork sequence while hitting a tennis ball. Paganini would place numbered sticks in the 4 corners of a square and place a player in the middle with a medicine ball. Paganini would call out a number, and the player would have to sprint to the corresponding stick and hold the medicine ball aloft. It was about mental agility as well as physical agility, and he would also test the player's ability to maintain the integrity of their technique under duress by having them do quick and intense sessions of cardio work on court, sometimes on a stationary bike, and then immediately transition to all-out 2-on-1 hitting drills. Paganini was way ahead of his time, a genius in fact, and it's reflected in what Marc Rosé, who also worked with him, has to say about him. Rosé often sees today's fitness trainers working with players at tournaments or in videos posted to social media. Putain, Rosé said, deploying a French expletive. It's practically the same thing I did with Pierre 25 years ago. Of course, there are things that have improved, but lots of fitness trainers have been influenced by Pierre. His results speak for themselves. If tomorrow somebody asked me to coach them, I would say, okay, do 4 months with Paganini, and then we'll talk. There's even more evidence of this genius in what others have to say about Paganini, those that have had the privilege of having been trained by him. Both remember Paganini telling them that the tour players in the next generations would play much longer. Nobody at that time was saying that, Magdalena said. Most people were saying the opposite, that tennis is very tough on the body, that the players don't have an off-season and they will be more and more injured. But Paganini believed tennis-specific training, smarter scheduling, improved recovery methods, and better, bigger support teams would lengthen careers. His vision has proved correct, looking at the number of players on both the men's and women's tours deep into their 30s still playing and even improving their rankings. Pierre didn't believe in the stereotype that once you're over 30, your athletic ability declines, Magdalena said. He really believed if you work the right way, you can play much longer. I loved reading this. It's a reminder that Federer had the good fortune of coming across someone like Paganini, and as Christopher Clarey himself points out, in life and certainly in pro tennis, it is really about what you do with your good fortune and what you make of your opportunities, and Federer built on many of them rather than squander them. Lessons here perhaps for all of us normal people with normal lives and careers. I really hope you can see more of Paganini in the documentary, but his preference for being in the background doesn't leave me feeling hopeful, so we'll see. Vavrinec developed into a solid professional player, but her game was limited. She did not have the quality to be a top player, but for sure she could have been top 50, said Eric Van Harpen, who coached Grand Slam champions Arantxa Sanchez Vicario and Conchita Martinez. She was a good baseliner, very athletic, very powerful, very strong, but kind of mechanical, Grovenveld said. She had no big weapons, but she was compensating with her ability to keep the ball in play and run all day. She would bite into a match and she would fight. That, my friends, is a very small window into exactly how she was so impactful in Federer's career. Mirka was a big believer in me not wasting any sort of talent, Federer told me many years later, because she knew herself that she was limited to a degree. She was extremely hardworking, but she knew with my talents I could achieve so many more things, and that belief was very influential. Having personally experienced something like this, I can tell you it's not only the belief that is necessary, but also the support that goes hand in hand that allows you to focus on your goals. I think Roger owes 50% of his career to Mirka because she manages an incredible number of things, said Marc Rosé, who has known them since before they started dating. If you are an elite athlete and you are married with an actress and she says that's great, you practice or go to this tournament, but maybe we should do this or that instead, that is perhaps why your career stops more quickly. He also liked that she understood and played the game at a high level. I never started dating a tennis player because of that, Federer told me. But in my situation, I think it really does help because she knows in some ways what it takes. And she did it on a level that was still very good, but not at my level. She already put in a massive amount of hours herself. So when I tell her, look, I need to go practice, she's the first to say, I know you need it. And you need only maybe 20% of what I needed. It's not just this, the Federers have also managed to have a family on tour. And I can imagine what people will comment down below in response to this, like, oh, of course it's easy when you're as loaded as them. But I want to remind people that money only solves money problems. Have you ever worked with people with newborns, especially if the couple must manage all of the load alone? I've seen so many careers stall because of this, and I've always hated the expectation that your professional life stay the same despite the fact that everything in your personal life literally took a 180. Lessons here perhaps for anyone watching that's in a position of leadership or an executive at a company. Mirka had made it clear that she was open to moving up the timetable if there were no medical issues. Every day, Mirka was like, are we going? Are we going? Federer said. She was ready. If anyone wonders how Federer played on with great success for more than a decade after becoming a family man, much of the explanation is in that short paragraph. She's a rock, Federer said. It's a word he's often used to describe his wife. So strong, and maybe that's from tennis as well. Her mind is very strong, and also the way she's handling everything now since the births. It's what I expected from Mirka because she's such a wonderful person, but for her to prove it to me and show it to me what a great mother she will be and is now, it's great. Had Mirka not been ready, I strongly believe the Federers would have adjusted with no real impact to the final tally of the Grand Slam titles that Federer ended up with. This is because some people are naturally inclined to be good in an operational or planning context, and I believe Mirka is one of those. This natural inclination can be a superpower if you couple it with determination and hard work, the kind that Mirka showed in getting to be a professional tennis player. It is clear that this superpower was applied in earnest to Federer's career. As Clarey points out at the very beginning of the book, his path from temperamental, bleach-blonde teenager with dubious style sense to one of the most elegant and self-possessed great athletes has been a wrong-running act of will, not destiny. Okay, this little bit, before the Grand Slam titles and the fame about the time when Federer was injured is pretty illuminating. During his hiatus, he became a chauffeur. Michael Lammer had taken over as Federer's housemate after Yves Allegro, and then Sven Swinen had moved on. Lammer was trying to rehabilitate an ankle injury but still needed to get to his high school classes. Federer, who now had his driver's license, volunteered to be of service. Roger was like, okay, I'll come pick you up at school and I'll bring you to school because I'm also injured and my schedule is very flexible. I'll be the taxi driver for you, Lammer said. Mirka Vavrinec, who was in Biel trying to recover from her own injuries, was also spending considerable time with Lammer and Federer. Mirka started to run the apartment for us, thankfully, so that was lucky, Federer told me with a chuckle. Michael and me, we still laugh about it. Michael came to visit me and we had dinner and we were talking about it again, how good it was to have Mirka in our life. Finally, we could find stuff and finally we could breathe normally again from all the dust being cleaned up. I don't think this was forced, but a gradual and natural transition. Here's how the book describes it. The pain was constant and she stopped for several months before deciding on surgery on her heel. During her recovery period in the autumn of 2002, Roger asked if she could help book a hotel for him. Gradually, she took on more and more of the travel planning for Roger and Peter Lundgren, who was then his coach. Others who know the Federers note that Mirka can play the bad cop to Roger's good cop, and that her straightforward approach and capacity for confrontation can allow him to preserve the role he prefers. Roger likes to keep it smooth, no conflict, but she can be tough and make it tough, said one former player who spoke anonymously to avoid damaging his relationship with the couple. She has a lot of influence on Roger, his tennis, and his schedule. I would have struggled with that. It would have not been good for my marriage. Mirka was really direct, Anna Cohn said. She was asking questions saying, "This is where Roger has had issues strategically. What is your philosophy about this stuff?" It was really information gathering. I never felt I was under the gun, and Roger was the same way. I never felt oppressed by it, and I never felt it was out of bounds. And the more I got to be around them, the more I respected and appreciated their relationship and roles. This is incredibly hard to pull off, and I think it speaks to their social sensibilities that they were able to straddle this line. Here's this bit that caught my attention at the very beginning of the book. Federer is widely perceived as a natural, and yet he is a meticulous planner who has learned to embrace routine and self-discipline, plotting his schedule well in advance and in considerable detail. "I usually have an idea of the next 1.5 years and a very good idea about the next 9 months, he said in Argentina. "I can tell you what I'll be doing on Monday before Rotterdam or what I'm doing Saturday before Indian Wells. I mean, not hour by hour, but I can pretty much talk it through day by day." It would of course be ideal to get Mirka's perspective on all of this, but she and Roger decided in the mid-2000s that she would stop giving interviews, part of an increasingly muscular effort to preserve their private life. Wise choice, I think, especially in the context of today's social media that seems to polarize more often than not. So, out of respect for the Federers, I will end this section here and leave the rest for you to read in this book. And knowing and having read all of this, I don't expect the Federer family to feature too strongly in the documentary. I want to close this video with this bit from the book that really got to me. It's about how Clarey thought that Marat Safin, Federer, and Nadal could have been the big three of the mid-2000s. Safin was a genuinely cutting-edge talent, and I'm convinced that he, Federer, and Nadal could have run roughshod over the 2000s together in the sort of three-way rivalry that later became all the rage. But it was not to be. While Federer came remarkably close to maximizing his abilities and optimizing his chances, Safin undeniably did not. It is hard not to wonder what might have been if he, in his teens, had met a fitness guru like Paganini, spent some quality time with a performance psychologist like Marcoli, or found a life partner like Vavrinec who understood and supported all that was required to remain a tennis champion and had no problem speaking her truth to power. It takes a village to make a champion, and truly exceptional people within that village for someone like Federer to reach the heights that he did. Lessons here perhaps for all of us that feel like they are struggling to reach their potential.